Welcome to the Deep Dive. So today we're doing a deep dive into, well, it might be the single densest day of global news. Policy shifts, corporate shakeups, really, in recent memory, September 22nd, 2025. You shared this mountain of sources, and looking through them, it's more than just a list of big events, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really feels like the day these long simmering fault lines, geopolitical, domestic, they just seem to snap all at once.
It absolutely is. A really concentrated snapshot of, global tension. Our sources, they're laser focused on this convergence. You've got major diplomatic action, mostly around the UN General Assembly opening, UNGA in New York. But then it mixed right in with that are these high stakes policy moves from Washington. And these big regulatory fights, the kind that, well, could reshape tech and finance for years.
Right. So our mission today isn't just like listing what happened. It's to filter through this information overload and give you the deep synthesis.
Yeah.
We need to try and understand why all these separate things, from nuclear arms control down to some obscure steel plant in Illinois, why they were all somehow connected on the very same day.
Exactly. The big theme here is rapid escalation. We're looking at simultaneous, really high-level action across geopolitics, domestic political polarization, and regulatory enforcement. And this convergence, all happening right as the UNGA opens, it just suddenly cranked the diplomatic and military temperature way up.
Yeah.
Globally.
Okay, let's start where the heat seemed highest then. The global stage. Specifically, this really profound diplomatic shift on Palestinian statehood. I mean, for decades, major Western powers always insisted recognition could only come after direct peace talks with Israel. And that stance just crumbled almost overnight.
That's the critical point. The momentum, it had been building for a while, but September 22nd, that was the day the dam really broke. France announced its formal recognition. Malta followed suit, saying they'd act formally right there at the General Assembly, and they were joining Britain, Canada, Australia, Portugal, who'd already signaled they planned to recognize Palestine.
The symbolic weight is just enormous.
Yeah.
But what's the tangible consequence? I mean, the U.S. and Israel still fundamentally oppose this, right? They argue recognition have to follow negotiation.
Right, and what's fascinating is how immediately it polarized things. So proponents hoped, this wave of recognition might empower moderates, maybe revive the two-state idea, but the sources immediately picked up on a hard counter-escalation. Israeli officials, reacting directly, started floating steps towards formal annexation of parts of the West Bank.
Wow.
Yeah, so this symbolic diplomatic win, it risks triggering this massive, potentially irreversible countermove on the ground.
And all this diplomatic friction, it's happening against a backdrop of just unimaginable human cost. The sources detail this intensified bombardment of Gaza City, at least 61 people killed in just 24 hours. And the total reported death toll, tragically over 65,300.
That's the paradox the UN was grappling with, even as these devastating numbers were coming out, and with the UN's own genocide findings still hanging in the air, the US was simultaneously pushing forward with this enormous proposed arms deal to Israel, $6 billion.
$6 billion, that's just staggering. We're talking Apaches, infantry assault vehicles, really high-end stuff. Why push that through now? At the exact moment, global diplomatic pressure is peaking at the UN.
Well, it signals a very firm, continued commitment to military support, regardless of the shifting political sands at the UNGA. And if you connect this to the wider conflict, that same day saw other deadly incidents just underscoring the regional instability. An Israeli airstrike killed 5 in southern Lebanon, 3 children and their father among them. And separately, in Yemen, another strike, reportedly Israeli, killed 31 journalists and media workers at 2 newspaper offices.
31 journalists?
Yeah, the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, called it the single deadliest attack on press freedom in 16 years. So this extreme conflict, it's the shaky foundation for all the UN diplomacy happening.
Okay, let's shift gears. Second, huge global flashpoint, Russia and the fate of nuclear arms control. The whole system governing the world's biggest nuclear arsenals has been eroding, creating this profound security vacuum.
Right, and this is a classic case of a tactical move, one that gives political cover but doesn't offer, well, genuine security. President Putin proposed a 1-year extension to the existing nuclear weapons treaty framework. Now, experts pretty much universally agreed, look, a stopgap is better than total collapse. But the key insight is how it was offered. A short extension, crucially without inspections, and with no clear plan for follow-on talks.
No inspections. So practically, what does that actually mean?
It means we avoid what arms control folks call a verification dark age, where you lose all transparency into the other side's arsenal. But it doesn't solve the long-term strategic problem at all. In fact, you could argue a short extension without verification actually shifts the leverage entirely to Russia. They get political credit for proposing stability, but they dodge any binding constraints or, necessary checks. It's stabilization, but maybe on their terms.
And this global security tension, it links directly to that volatile border between Russia and NATO, doesn't it? Especially around the Baltics.
That's exactly right. The UN itself was the scene of these heated clashes that day. Western ministers confronting Russia over alleged airspace incursions. Estonia specifically claimed 3 Russian jets entered their airspace, which Moscow denied, of course. But the immediate impact is this heightened risk of miscalculation over the Baltics, the Baltic Sea. It isn't necessarily about deliberate invasion plans, but the danger that an accidental shoot-down could trigger rapid, uncontrolled escalation.
And that risk is clearly driving military planning. We saw Poland's prime minister announce this very strong, frankly highly risky response. After several Russian jet incursions, Poland declared it would shoot down any unauthorized object violating its airspace.
Which raises the stakes dramatically. And if you connect that back to the broader European defense posture, Germany is now making incredibly specific plans. They're setting up medical capacity for up to 1,000 wounded troops per day in a hypothetical conflict with Russia.
1,000 a day.
Yes. That grim level of planning tells you exactly how seriously NATO is taking the escalation risk, especially after Poland's policy shift and these constant airspace violations.
Okay, so while the world's watching New York and the Baltics, let's turn to Washington, because the administration there was fighting battles on, well, diplomacy, ethics, public health messaging, all at the same time. President Trump was juggling this incredibly packed schedule of bilaterals during the UNGA.
Yeah, that day saw major meetings. UN Secretary General, leaders from Ukraine, Argentina, the EU, and crucially this really complex multilateral meeting with 8 major Middle Eastern and Asian countries. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan were all in there. The sheer density of those meetings, it shows the administration's strategy on Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, China. It was all fully under the global microscope.
Yet while doing all that high-wire global diplomacy, the administration made this highly controversial public health announcement back home, right in the middle of UNGA week. Why choose that day to revive these disputed claims about vaccines and Tylenol?
That is the strategic puzzle, isn't it? President Trump and the HHS Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., they announced this broad autism research push, but they did it while reviving these really disputed claims linking vaccines and also the common pain reliever acetaminophen Tylenol used during pregnancy to autism. Scientists, medical groups, they immediately pushed back on the messaging because there wasn't any new evidence to support it.
And the risk of putting that message out there.
Well, the fear is sort of twofold. One, it could undermine public trust in established health advice, maybe lower vaccination rates. And 2, it might encourage unsafe medication choices during pregnancy if people start avoiding Tylenol based on fears not backed by current data. It felt like an extremely risky public health move, timed right when the global spotlight was already on the White House.
And speaking of domestic controversy, that same day, allegations surfaced about Tom Homan, the border czar. He's really been the face of the administration's most aggressive immigration policies.
Yes, Reuters reported allegations from a sting operation suggesting Homan had accepted $50,000. Now, Homan denied the claims, but the political reaction was instant. The White House just swiftly rejected the report, stated publicly Homan retained the president's full support. And that immediate strong defense, it just fueled these intense debates about ethics firewalls, especially around these high-profile, really aggressive enforcement roles that carry significant discretionary power.
Yeah, that controversy seemed to fit the heightened domestic political rhetoric we also saw that day.
Absolutely. The language of retribution, of executive power, it was really palpable. President Trump escalated his promises against perceived enemies, even stating explicitly, "I hate my opponent." And on the practical side of executive power, he also signed an executive order imposing these massive $100,000 fees for H-1B visas.
$100,000 per visa.
Per visa. These are the main route for high-skilled temporary foreign workers. So it sends this clear, very assertive signal that the administration is using every tool it has to reshape immigration policy unilaterally.
Okay, let's transition over to the economic and tech battlegrounds, because September 22nd saw major flashpoints there too. First up, the start of the remedies trial in that massive Google antitrust showdown.
That's right. The remedies trial for the Department of Justice's big antitrust case against Google kicked off in Virginia. And the stakes? They really couldn't be higher. The government isn't asking for, like, small behavioral changes. They're asking the court to order Google to spin off core advertising businesses, including AdX.
Can you just quickly define AdX for us again?
Sure, AdX is Google's advertising exchange. It's basically the engine that matches publishers who have ad space to sell with advertisers wanting to buy that space programmatically. It's arguably the absolute core of their digital ad monopoly. Google's fighting back hard, obviously. They're arguing a structural breakup would just create chaos in the market, saying behavioral fixes are enough. But, I mean, if the DOJ wins this, it fundamentally reshapes the economics of digital advertising for every publisher, every advertiser, globally.
Meanwhile, that long-running U.S.-China tech fight over TikTok, it seemed to be nearing some kind of conclusion.
Yeah, officials signaled a deal structure was getting close. The proposal involves Oracle and Silver Lake leading a U.S. investor consortium. And crucially, ByteDance, the Chinese parent company, would own less than 20% of the new TikTok U.S. entity. Oracle would host and secure all the American user data. And a 120-day enforcement pause was signaled, basically to give them time to nail down the final details, the governance structure. It's a really high-stakes, complicated agreement, trying to calm those security fears without forcing a total fire sale.
Okay, now something really unusual happened in the industrial sector that day. This use of federal power regarding the Nippon Steel acquisition of U.S. Steel.
Yes, this was fascinating. The White House pulled out this quite rare tool. Analysts called it the golden share option. It was apparently part of the original acquisition agreement. A golden share, it's essentially a right the government retains to veto specific operational or structural decisions in a private deal, usually when it involves critical infrastructure.
Okay, so how do they actually use it here?
They used it to block U.S. Steel's plan to stop processing steel slabs at its Granite City works near St. Louis. The administration framed the intervention as vital for, quote, safeguarding industrial base resilience and protecting American jobs. This sets a really dramatic, very clear precedent. The federal government is now showing it's willing to step in and actually override corporate operational decisions within major cross-border M&A deals if it feels core national industrial capacity is threatened.
Wow. Okay, finally, in the finance world, we saw this interesting convergence of corporate strategy and digital assets. Bitcoin BTC meeting M&A.
Indeed. Strive announced it was acquiring Semler Scientific in an all-stock deal. But the twist was, as part of the transaction, the combined company would immediately buy nearly 5,900 additional Bitcoins. The new entity would hold over 10,900 BTC in total, basically anchoring its treasury value in digital assets.
Why anchor value in BTC instead of, traditional reserves? What's the short-term benefit there for shareholders?
Well, the strategy seems simple but aggressive. They're banking on the perceived long-term value appreciation and maybe inflation hedging properties of Bitcoin. The idea is to make the combined company fundamentally more attractive to institutional investors who want exposure to digital assets but maybe don't want to buy them directly. It's a really clear sign of how corporate Bitcoin treasuries are moving into mainstream M&A strategy, despite, the obvious volatility risk.
That is a huge shift in financial thinking. Okay, let's wrap up with a quick look at science, space, and the shifting Earth. NASA actually brought some genuinely good news that day.
Yes, a welcome break from all the geopolitical intensity. NASA unveiled its new class of 10 astronaut candidates, selected from over 8,000 applicants, which is amazing. And crucially, 6 women and 4 men were chosen. This is actually the first time women have outnumbered men in a new NASA astronaut class. It significantly expands the pipeline for the upcoming Artemis lunar flights, deep space missions, sends a really clear signal about inclusive exploration.
That's great. But in stark contrast to that planned exploration, the planet itself was showing some frightening volatility.
Yeah, we saw simultaneous major weather events unfolding. Hurricane Gabrielle rapidly intensified that day to a Category 4, 140-mile-per-hour winds, and it was tracking dangerously toward the Azores. At the exact same time, Super Typhoon Ragasa slammed into the northern Philippines, forcing mass evacuations across Cagayan province. Warnings of landslides, severe floods. Just devastating.
And kind of underscoring the long-term climate crisis, Swiss scientists reported that the melting of Switzerland's glaciers is accelerating at a, quote, frightening rate, showing unprecedented ice loss.
So if we try to synthesize this incredibly intense 24-hour period, what do we see? We saw geopolitical norms fundamentally broken with the broad recognition of Palestinian statehood. Nuclear constraints were perhaps temporarily masked by Russia's tactical inspection-free offer. U.S. policy was asserted very forcefully, both domestically with those controversial Tylenol autism claims, the defense of borders our homeland and globally, with that unprecedented intervention on U.S. steel and the brokered TikTok settlement.
It's just clear that the sheer speed and concentration of all these converging pressures, it feels unsustainable. Everything we discussed today shows how quickly global and domestic policy can pivot and just how high the stakes become when these major diplomatic, military, and corporate factors all align on the same day. Whether it's, diplomatic recognition by 5 major Western powers that proposed $6 billion arms deal, or using federal golden share power to protect one single steel plant.